Hey, aloha, Merry Christmas. Hey guys, it's good to see you over Zoom here, and we'll just kind of get right into this. There's uh, there's a lot of hurting people in the world today, and you guys know this. I don't really have to tell you that. Um, I guess the reason I bring that up is each and every one of us we experience hurt and sorrow and pain to some degree from time to time. And I think a question that comes up because everybody experiences pain and hurt. A lot of people experience it more than others. But a question that really comes up is where is God in all of this, and why would He allow people to hurt and suffer like they do? And so this morning, what we're going to do is we're going to try to get into the mind of God. I know that may sound like a tall task, but that's what we're going to do. We're gonna explore what He thinks about and how He thinks, and the reason we're able to do that is because He reveals it to us in biblical Scripture. So this morning we're going to look at how God thinks. We're going to talk about how He sees things and what He thinks about when He sees hurting people. And this is really important for us to know and to think about, because if we don't understand how God thinks about hurting people, then we might end up straying away from God. And if we stay there, then we'll keep getting further and further away from Him. And that path is going to end up in a situation in which our lives increasingly experience more and more difficulties. So today we're going to be in Isaiah chapters 15 and 16. Isaiah chapters 15 and 16. You can turn there in your Bibles if you want to. Last week, we covered a very large section in Isaiah. It was chapters 13 all the way to chapter 23. And the reason why we looked at such a large section is because much of the chapters in this part of Isaiah has a very similar message. So instead of preaching through several messages on the same theme, I just thought we would kind of condense it and put them together. And we saw that Isaiah was speaking to his people, the people of Judah, who were also Israelites, as you know. And he was speaking to them on behalf of God, because that's obviously what a prophet does. And he was talking to them about not only their future, but also the future of the surrounding nations. And sometimes chapters like these, they can be really hard to read because it talks about a lot of doom and gloom. Much of it talks about God's coming judgment and punishment on the people in these various nations. But as we saw last week, a key component to God's message to these nations, and really the people of all times, people like you and me today, is the question, where do you find security? Now, of course, we can find our security in God. He's our creator, He's our sustainer. And of course, this is the way that He designed it to be. He wants us to find, He wants us to be able to find security in Him alone. Or we can find our security in the wrong places, which would be really any place other than God. And when we do this, bad things end up happening. And ultimately, any security that we find apart from God, it's just not going to last. And so we talked about this message last week from chapters 13 to 23. And so this week, we're going to go back and look at chapters 15 and 16 just a little closer. And like last week, I'm not going to read these chapters, since it's kind of a long passage, but I would encourage you to go back and read it. But first of all, what I'm going to do here, I'm going to tell you what this passage is about. And if you want to, you can open up to Isaiah chapters 15 and 16 and just kind of follow along as I summarize. And then after we do that, I'm gonna look at how all of this relates to us today. So, so in chapters 15 and 16, it talks about God's future plans for the nation of Moab and about how the people of Moab are going to be hurting terribly in the future. That is, in the future of Isaiah's day. And so Moab. Um, also, I wanted to mention that in this passage, when we look at it closely, we learn how God sees hurting people, and that's really what we're wanting to get at this morning. So, so when we think about Moab, Moab was to the east of Judah, on the other side of the Dead Sea. They were distant cousins of Judah. And so, as you guys know, Judah and the rest of the Israelites, they were descendants of Abraham. And the Moabites were descendants of a man by the name of Lot. And Lot was Abraham's nephew. So there's the connection, there's the relationship there. And the Bible indicates that their ancestor Lot was a true believer. He was someone who trusted in God. And so I bring that up because the Moabites would have known about Abraham's God. They would have known about the God of Israel, the God of Judah. They would have known about Isaiah's God. But historically, they mostly chose to follow after other gods. Of course, another way we could put that, they chose historically to trust in things other than God to bring them satisfaction in life. And that's really not any different for a lot of the people in our world today. And then oftentimes over the years, Moab, they would have disagreements and scuffles with Israel and Judah. But even though Moab mainly didn't have anything to do with God, Isaiah seems to hint that life had been pretty good in the land of Moab. He seems to hint at the fact that the people were happy, their work was successful, uh, they had had fruitful and successful vineyards. Uh, Also, that there had been a lot of celebration over their vineyards. In fact, um, they were very proud of their accomplishments. Life had been very good for the people of Moab, and they didn't really seem to even need God. And so, when you think about that, do you see people like that in the world today? People who don't really seek God, people who seem quite content and happy without God in their life? Well, the Moabites, they must have been like that. And then Isaiah, thinking about this background here, Isaiah, he gives an oracle about Moab. And an oracle is just a word from God talking about Moab's future. And so we come to chapter 15, verse 1. You can follow along if you want to. I'm just going to be summarizing it here. But basically, what Isaiah says here is that Moab is going to turn into a desolate place very, very quickly. Everything's going to be going along just fine, and then things are going to get really bad fast. Now, you guys realize that I was not here on island when Hurricane Iniki hit us. But a lot of people have told me that the things unexpectedly and drastically changed for the worse in about a day or so, right? Well, for the Moabites, it wasn't going to be an unexpected hurricane. It was going to be a ruthless army who was going to come in and attack them and just decimate the place. This was probably going to be the Assyrian army. History seems to point in that direction. And then we come to verses 2 and 3 and 4, and Isaiah says that things are going to be so terrible that the people are going to be in tears, weeping. And they're going to be crying out to their gods for help. They're going to be trying to find comfort and relief and help from what they trust in the most to rescue them. And then we come to verses 5 and 6 and 7. And here Isaiah expresses his personal sadness over all of this. And when he does this, this is kind of representing God's sadness Okay, so when Isaiah expresses his grief and sadness, this is also representative of God's sadness. And he paints a picture of a people who are trying to run away. They're trying to get out of the land of Moab whenever there's still time. They're trying to gather what little they have left of value. They're trying to leave the country with whatever they can bring with them. And he talks about how sad this is, how pitiful it is. And then as chapter 15 comes to a close in verses 8 and 9, Isaiah describes the Moabites as wailing in sorrow. Not only because things are so bad, but because they expect it to get worse. And then we move on into chapter 16. We come to verse 1, and Isaiah suggests that Moab ought to call out to his own nation for help. They ought to call out to Judah to help them, the king of Judah, either to come and help them or to be a refuge for them to flee to. And then in verse 2, there's this picture of Moabite women in a panic, running around in all different directions. And then we come to verses 3 and the first part of verse 4, and Isaiah goes back to the suggestion that Moab ought to call out to Judah for help. And then in the rest of verse 4 and on into verse 5, Isaiah gives the reason why they should call out to Judah. He says there's going to be a king in Judah who eventually is coming. He's going to be somebody who can help them. He's going to be somebody who will rule not with oppression, but he will rule in righteousness. And of course, today we know who this coming king is. It's Jesus. You know, he was coming, but this Jesus was able to help them even before he came by just trusting in God. So the question at this point is, will Moab trust in the one who God is going to send to help them? And it appears not, because when you get to verse 6, Isaiah describes how proudful, how prideful Moab is. It seems that Moab is not willing to humble themselves and to submit themselves to God. And so this makes the situation even worse. Here you have Moab in a hopeless and helpless situation. And yet the God of the universe comes onto the scene, offering them help and hope. These people have recognized they need help. And yet it appears that they refuse the help that comes from the Almighty God. And when you think about this, it's truly very, very sad. And so we come to verses 7 and 8, and Isaiah says that everyone ought to wail and moan for Moab's desolate circumstances, especially Moab. They ought to be weeping and wailing for themselves, not just for their physical despair, but also for their spiritual downfall. For our spiritual well-being, it's so important that we recognize our sin problem and to recognize we cannot fix it by ourselves. And our sinful spiritual situation, that ought to bother us. It ought to bother us knowing that we have been separated from the peace of being in a right relationship with our Almighty Creator. And we should call out to God to help us. We should call out to Him to cleanse us spiritually, to forgive us, and to trust in Him to help us and to guide us. And when we do that, He will. And guys, this is why Jesus said in Matthew chapter 5, blessed are those who are poor in spirit. Blessed are those who weep, or blessed are those who mourn. That's kind of an odd thing to say in a way, isn't it? Why would you be blessed or happy about being saddened? But that's what he says. What he's saying here, Jesus is saying, blessed are those who are bothered about their spiritual condition. Blessed are those who are bothered about the sin that's in their life. So he's saying, blessed are those who are bothered that they have turned away from God, that they have neglected him and not trusted in him, and that they've been spiritually separated from God because of it. And he says they're blessed because they are bothered enough to call out to God for help. The Bible all throughout refers to this as calling on the name of the Lord. He says when you do that, you are blessed, because these are the people who are going to be blessed. These are the people who are content and joyful and at peace, because God is going to help them. God is going to spiritually cleanse them and bring them relief, and he's going to give them what they need, and he's going to bless them eternally. But it seems that the Moabites were not doing this. They were not troubled or bothered because of their spiritual separation from God. And Isaiah says, man, they ought to be. Everyone ought to weep for them. In verse 9, Isaiah himself weeps for them. Again, showing that God also weeps for them. And then Isaiah kind of shifts here a little bit, talking about the destruction of their successful vineyards. There was obviously a lot of celebration that had gone into their vineyards, reaping them. But in verse 10, Isaiah says, not anymore. And in verse 11, Isaiah expresses his and God's sadness about all of this. And then, in the last 3 verses of the chapter, you see what Moab ultimately turns to in their desperation. And you see their final outcome. So in verse 12, Isaiah says that Moab will seek help from their own gods. They're going to seek help from their own things, and it's not going to do any good for them. And then finally, in verses 13 and 14, Isaiah says that very few Moabites will even be left in the near future. And so this was an oracle from Isaiah. Again, it's a prediction of what was going to happen to Moab. And history indicates that all this came true. Really, in Isaiah's day, the Moabites were pretty much wiped out. And so this is a very sad story of a people who were hurting terribly. A people in which things didn't get any better, it only got worse. And guys, history is full of people like this, with all kinds of different problems and all kinds of levels of suffering. Situations in which things don't get better, but they get worse. We've seen this with people in the past. We see it with people today all over the world. Maybe you see this in certain people around you, or maybe you feel like somebody who's going through something like this. So the question is, what is going through God's mind when stuff like this happens to people? When they're hurting and suffering, what is he thinking about? What does he see? What does he think about when he looks down and sees so many people hurting and suffering? Well, as we look at chapters 15 and 16, God reveals some things about himself. And what I want us to think about, I want us to think about 3 ways that God sees hurting people, 3 things that go through God's mind when he sees hurting people. And the first one is, he knows that he can help them. He knows that he can help them. That's what's going through his mind. And why is that? Why can he help them? Because he's God. He can do anything. As long as it doesn't mean not being himself. That's the one thing that God cannot do. He must be himself. He's all powerful. There is no problem that anyone has that's too big for him to handle. He is greater than any problem that we face. And he never gets overwhelmed. I find myself getting overwhelmed, it seems like often. Do you? He never does. I find that amazing about God. He's got so much to take care of and so much to keep his attention on, and he can do it. It's easy for him. No one or nothing is ever able to get in the way of what he wants to do. He's able to bring people spiritual cleansing and forgiveness. He can do that. And he's chosen to do that through Jesus. He's never sidetracked. He's never surprised. He's never caught off guard about anything. And that's because he knows everything. He knows everything that's ever happened. He knows everything that's going on right now. He knows everything that's ever going to happen. He even knows what I call the what ifs. He knows everything that could have happened, but it doesn't. I think it's amazing. He knew everything about these Moabite people, even before it ever happened. He's never wrong about any of these things because he's ultimately in control of everything. And when we say that, that's what we call him being sovereign. So when God looks down on hurting people, he knows he can help them. That's what's going through his mind. Here's a second way God sees hurting people, a second thing that goes through his mind, and that is he hurts when they hurt. He hurts when they hurt. He hurts when you hurt. It brings great pain to God, to his heart, to see people hurt and suffer. Those who he has taken great interest in to create and to knit together with great precision. He has knit together each and every person uniquely. He's knit together everybody's physical makeup in a very unique way. And every personality is different and unique, and he's knit it together with great precision and care with his hands and fingers. People are very special to God. They've been created in his image. Multiple times throughout our passage, Isaiah himself expresses his deep grief and sorrow for the people of Moab. And of course, God's grief and sorrow would be much more than Isaiah's would have been. You know, it's with Isaiah, it's just a reflection and representation of God's pain for their despair. But again, God's would have been much more than Isaiah's. So God is not only able to help hurting people, he wants to. He cares. He loves each and every person immensely. God looks down, and when he looks down and sees hurting people, he hurts. That goes through his mind. And then finally, here's a third way that God sees hurting people. And this is a key one. He wants them to know how important it is for them to be loyal to him. He wants them to know how important it is for them to be loyal to him. That is most important when it comes to us or how he sees us. So far, we have said that God is able to help hurting people and that he wants to. And so another way that a lot of people put this, they'll say, God is all powerful and he is very loving. And this is what often leads to a discussion called the problem of evil. You see, if God is both all powerful and he's incredibly loving, then there shouldn't be any hurting people in the world, right? He's powerful enough to take care of it and he wants to. So there shouldn't be any hurting people. There shouldn't be any evil in the world for that matter. But there is. There is evil and there is hurting people. So something appears wrong with this picture. And people try to wrap their minds around it. And so as people try to think through this, one conclusion that they reach is, well, either God is truly loving, but he's not as powerful as people think he is. He's not strong enough to keep people from hurting. Or he is truly all powerful, but he doesn't really love people like people want to believe he does. Or they'll say, he's not really all powerful or loving. Or someone will conclude, I just don't think he exists. But guys, he does exist. He is all powerful. He is incredibly loving. So how do we make sense of this? Well, there's a third component here that we haven't taken into consideration yet. And that is, we need to be aware of this. It's so important. The thing that is most important to God regarding the people he's created, it's not whether they're hurting or not, although that is important to him. It's not whether they're happy or not, although that's important to him as well. The most important thing regarding us as his created people, the most important thing to him is that we are in a right relationship with him, a relationship in which we trust in him, a relationship in which we are attracted to him, in which we depend on him and look to him for answers and guidance and provisions and protection and meaning in our lives and direction and satisfaction. God wants his created people to have this kind of relationship with him. He wants this more than he wants anything else for us. Having this right relationship with him is more important than just simply being happy or being happy without him. He doesn't want that. And by the way, any happiness or contentment that anyone has ultimately comes from God. And he wants people to know this. He wants them to recognize it for what it is. He wants people to appreciate him for who he is and for what he has done for them. Now, I want to talk about God's nature here for just a second. Because of God's nature, because of who he is, and he cannot not be himself, he must be himself. That's part of his nature. He cannot go against his nature. Because of who he is, he cannot tolerate someone rejecting him for who he is. He cannot tolerate someone refusing to submit their loyalty to him. Now, he can tolerate it, just to be fair here, he can tolerate it for a little while because of his patience, but not forever. Eventually, his patience runs out, and his judgment comes upon those who reject him. And for some, that's an eternal judgment. So we're either loyal to God or we're loyal to something else, and that's what the Bible would call sin. Last week, I referred to a retired Old Testament professor from a Southern Baptist University, Union University in Western Tennessee, by the name of Gary Smith. I'm just going to refer to him this one time today. But in Gary Smith, in his studies, one of the things that has come to him, he said, God warns people of being loyal to sin. And he warns them for a couple of different reasons. First of all, he warns them to help them understand why they suffer. And he also wants them to have an opportunity to choose a different path, a path in which they submit their lives to him, to trust in Jesus, to bring forgiveness and cleansing, spiritual cleansing, that is. I wanted to bring this up because I think it's important to think about. Oftentimes, a natural disaster will take place in some part of the world. It happens all the time. You look in the news every day, it seems like there's something going on somewhere, at least every week. Terrible things that go on. And a common question that'll come up a lot of times is, Is God punishing the people of this city, or is he punishing the people of this particular region because of something they've done, some sort of evil they're currently doing? Well, I think we have to be really careful with how we answer that question. I think ultimately we have to say, well, I don't know. God could be punishing people because of certain things that they're doing as a society. And the reason I would say that is because we certainly see patterns of that in the Bible. But I think the thing we have to remember and be careful about, these are times when the Bible specifically tells us that these certain people are being punished because they've done something in particular. Unless the Bible tells us, or God reveals it to us in some way, I don't know. I can't be real certain that we can know for sure that God is punishing for some sort of specific sin or pattern of sin. But guys, here's something I want us to just remember. Oftentimes, natural disasters, they happen simply because we live in a fallen world. And so it's when things like this happen, it's a reminder that things in the world are not right. It's a reminder that the world is not flowing according to God's design, the way that he created it. It's a reminder that we are all sinners. And we need God, all of us. Now, you may be somebody today who recognizes that you haven't trusted in God with your life. You haven't trusted in Jesus, or you haven't been trusting him like you should. Maybe you're somebody that you haven't given your loyalty to him like he deserves. But let me encourage you to do that. Just call out to God and say, God, please help me. Help me to be who you've called me to be. I want to submit my life to you. I want to trust in you. I want to trust in your direction for my life, trust in your salvation and forgiveness for my life. I want to trust in your guidance. Help me, God. Just call out to him if you've never done that. You can say it out loud verbally, or you can say it quietly, silently to yourself in your mind, and he will hear you. The most important thing is that you mean it. If you call out to him and mean it, if you call out to him to help you, to rescue you, to make you one of his, he'll do it. He'll help you. And then I would encourage you to come and talk with me about it. Call me, email me, text me, whatever it is, but come and talk with me. That's really important. And you may be someone today who you're already a Christian believer. You say, I've done that already. I've trusted God with my life. And that's great. I thank God for that. But let me encourage you, as we think about this message, let me encourage you to reflect God's love and compassion towards those who are hurting. Let God shine through you. Reach out to people who are hurting in some way. Show your love to them, maybe through what you do, and talk with them. Listen to them. And point them in the right direction. Point them to the one who can help them. Point them to the one who loves them. Point them to the one who wants them to trust in Jesus. Have compassion on those who are hurting, even on those who reject the gospel, like the Moabites. Whatever it is, the main thing is we want to be a reflection of God and show love on all people.